Okay, so this is a series of videos that are introducing my system. And one of the things I want to do is, before I actually do a video for the general public, and this might find its way on the public in YouTube, I don't know yet. So I want to give some reasons for some of the things that I do when I describe our system, my approach. I have a belief that when you look at any sort of a system, and that involves any kind of system, you have to fundamentally understand the basis for the system. And in so doing, you have to make the time and energy to look carefully, with circumspection, and to look historically and virtually all aspects of that approach. Otherwise, you risk getting bad information. Bad information is a pox on martial arts, along with training incorrectly. However, many of us believe that if people had the right information about how to train, they wouldn't train incorrectly to begin with. I will go on that assumption. When you look at a system of martial arts, whether it be invented yesterday or in the 1500s, you're dealing with a succession of generations, a succession of teachers, and texts of various sorts. These are useful. They're part of that system. There's no question about that. We have to understand what those parts are and why they're important first. And we have to understand how that system fits in to the broader context, which is our physiology, our biological history. This is very important. You will find that before any system existed, there had to be a reason to invent one. So think about that for a second. You will also find that successive generations teaching any system becomes like a game of telephone, unfortunately. He said this originally, and by the time it goes around to the last person on the circle in the game, it doesn't sound anything like what was first uttered when the game began. Game of telephone. You form a circle, you whisper to the person next to you what was said by the first person, what is said by the last person. It's amusing. Well, martial arts works that way to some degree. Teachers are not taught how particular things work, so they reinvent them. Sometimes that's a gifted insight, sometimes it's garbage. How do we make that decision? We're taught to sort of give our loyalty to a system, and to be fair, ever since Bruce Lee and by the time MMA came along, some of that has been reevaluated, going to the opposite extreme at times, but being reevaluated is a start. Anyway, with that said, the first thing I look at is what makes sense from a physiological perspective about a movement, a technique, a weapon, etc. Okay? Because that is inviolate. Okay? You cannot have a system that purports to be effective but doesn't have any way that it makes sense biologically or physiologically. Okay? I'll give you an example of that. Physiologically, a lot of movement centering on fine motor coordination, that's a red flag. You want to use fine motor coordination very judiciously because it takes longer to train fine motor coordination. And even though you get more bang for your buck, it's easier to make mistakes with it. And it always has to be supported by big, strong movements that your body will be naturally enacting during a conflict because of the physiological state, your emotional, your psychological state. Okay? So that's one example. Another example is when any sort of an approach violates common sense. So you can look at when human beings started designing fighting implements. You can look at that based on when they started really building any implements. Okay? And you can also look at that from the perspective of when you were hunter-gatherer tribes, weapons were fairly straightforward. When you start to specialize, look at agriculture. Now you need more specialization in your techniques. Okay? You're not just hitting somebody over the head, stabbing somebody, slingshotting something. Okay? You're trying to do a more specific type of technique, whatever you call it, your field, in what you're doing. And you need that implement to represent that. By the time you get to factories, take a look at a video of a typical factory machine. Look at the technology that goes into that machine, and you will see incredible amount of understanding and knowledge and insight. Okay? So that's the progression. When somebody takes something that looks ridiculous and says that this is a weapon, or that, well, weapons were basically came from people taking agricultural things and they became our weapons. There's some truth to the second statement, but specifically, what happened was when people learned how to be more capable, they designed better implements. And when they had better materials, you eventually had a sort of a fine point in history where the technology was very successful. I don't know that you could duplicate a Masamune sword today, even. Okay? So keep these tropes in mind when you're evaluating the truth of something, when you're evaluating information. The second thing is, does it make sense from a movement perspective? Our bodies are designed to move a certain way. I've gone into great detail on other presentations about how that is. Whether we are primates or not, we move a certain way physiologically based on standing upright, based on how gravity works, etc. And there are things about that you have to be aware of. Not only reinforcing that, but what it means to go against that. Okay? It has to make sense. All right? When you see techniques that involve a lot of very elegant, very complex movements, inevitably they're inefficient. Okay? And there are exceptions to that. I mean, if you look at, as a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say most martial arts, when they started as systems, had good movement dynamics that were degraded over the years as people embellished them without any context for what they were originally intended. Capoeira is a perfect example of that. If you look at Maestro Bimba and the capoeira he was using, it's very different than a lot of the stuff that is very fluffy these days. Okay? An example would be if you're doing a spinning movement with your body where you're somersaulting, the There's a story about Maestro Bimbo, which is good for us to know here. He was in against a young lion that was fast. His spine was like the crack of a whip. And they were both going to do that rodeo, that technique where you do that somersault towards each other and you want to catch the person with your foot. And it's really, you can brain a person that way. So, sure enough, they go do their technique, and the young lion is missing 3 teeth. Maestro Bimbo is fine. And he goes, "What was that, Maestro Bimbo?" And Maestro Bimbo says, "That was my foot, my son." Now, the clever repartee notwithstanding, very simple concept here. When you do that technique, if you roll yourself into a smaller ball, you will get there first, and you don't need to be faster. The same concept that applies to Gurukemi, falling skills. You get yourself into a smaller shape, it is easier for you. You don't have to try to get up. You will naturally rise from the ground when you complete your roll, and you will get lower to the ground without having to try, and you're just moving more efficiently. That's the kind of insight that I'm talking about. One could argue by the time you get to break falling in judo, there are certain aspects of it that may not apply to a concrete parking lot. Can you break fall on concrete? Yeah, you can. You can't do it that way. Not from my experience. I wouldn't teach somebody to break fall with a heavy slamming motion. So these are examples. The movement has to make sense, okay? The third thing is you have to train not only through this idea of hammer and tongs. And let me explain that first. Everybody, when you train martial arts and you're younger, you should have some experience fighting. I don't care what it is. But get in there and mix it up and learn what it's like. Get that experience. You have to have some experience that way a bit, okay? Preferably, do a little bit of each. That is a state of mind, okay? It is a sort of a foreground by which, when you start to use techniques, if you're efficient and successful, you operate efficiently as a martial artist. People make the mistake of thinking because when you're sparring, you're successful with a technique or this technique, that means you'll use that technique on the street that way. It's true sometimes. It's not true all the time. Okay? Just like the idea that when you train a certain way with a form, that it's the same thing. It'll just work that way in the street. That's really not the idea of those things. You learn forms in martial arts in order to retain the knowledge. You become a physical textbook. If you want to teach somebody, you have tropes. You have a set of techniques that you can put together and work with. Okay? That helps you develop your technical skills. It doesn't mean that you're going to make the technique look like it does on the street in the form. Okay? That's unrealistic. Okay? So, I don't want to lose our focus here. We're talking about having technique make sense, right? We're talking about preparing ourselves in a way so we're realistic and using technique not as we imagine it, but as we have to use it. You get that experience fighting. Now you have that experience. And then when you start to use techniques, yes, you pressure test them, but you also have to understand that your body operates under a different set of conditions when you're in a fight that is life and death. And your training has to reflect that. This gets into a very important point about how you view things when you're in that situation, how your body feels, and preparing for that. And that's of vital importance because especially when you deal with weapons. You have to be very aware. And the way that you have to be aware is imagine yourself trying to see the car ahead of you in a really bad windstorm. Okay? You know, your body is used to making these big movements. Things slow down. You feel like you're sick sometimes as your adrenaline kicks in. You've got to be able to understand and work through all that. Okay? That's a big part of the training. That doesn't necessarily involve getting more comfortable sparring. Okay? I sparred for many, many years. I wouldn't even call it sparring. We actually fought in karate compared to what most people call it sparring. And I had sparring. We used to have sparring meets, and it's good for you, but you can also build a lot of bad habits, and you got to be very careful about that. There's levels to the game. Once you do that and you get comfortable with that, you want to really start looking at your habits with your muscle memory. Which brings us to the next point. You have to be comfortable with your martial art. You cannot try to do things. There's an old Chinese saying, use technique, lose. And what it means is when you're trying to do things, excuse me, you complicate things. The technique has to arise. If you do a martial arts technique properly, it should happen before you're aware of it. Somebody does that and your response happens. It should be that quick. And by the time you're catching up to where you just did, then you can set up that strategy. You can figure out what happened in the situation and respond to that. You have to first overcome this. Is this really happening? You have to overcome this. Why does my body feel so strange? And you have to overcome this. Things are just moving really slowly. But basically, that initial response is your muscle memory. It's not something that you can try to do always. So, has to be natural, okay? You have to have techniques taught so that you don't develop bad habits, you develop good habits, okay? All things are important. You have to understand what the things are in the art. Again, the forms are great because successive generations of teachers do not mean that knowledge was transmitted purely and effectively. It means that you've got a whole bunch of people maybe trying to recreate something or do their own thing. Or, I mean, most martial arts, look at the conflicts that happen in the style, right? I mean, if that doesn't tell you everything, to Japan's credit, it has one of the purest and most high standards regarding transmission of an art, and that's for good reason. You want to know where your information is coming from, and forms and texts, they give you that information. It's pure. You can use that, and then when you apply these other principles, you get effective training. So with all those things being said, one of the most important things is what we've lost in this generation, and that is it has been somehow equalized that when a martial art is a holistic way of doing things, when it is your life as a method, that makes you less of a fighter. Okay? Nothing could be farther from the truth. Okay? A martial art ultimately is a system of living that teaches you self-protection, teaches you warriorship, teaches you how to fight if you want to be a fighter, you want to be a teacher, you know how to utilize the martial arts aspects that are purely useful in that context. It teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to understand and really integrate into your world, okay? It teaches you to be an ethical human being. It teaches you to think critically, okay? And that's what we do in our system. We are not teaching you a one-dimensional art that, has been passed down and are a bunch of fighting tricks, okay? We are teaching you an art that draws sustenance from historical information. You will notice that when I speak with you, I have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different historical aspects. I happen to be well educated, and I apply that to my teaching. It also involves how you use your body properly. Really, really critically analyzing movement, because movement is where it ends and where it begins, okay? Your movement has to be really sublime in order to start to apply the different aspects of martial arts, okay? And we can get into that another time because it's more of a specific thing. Psychologically, teaches you how to deal psychologically, okay, with stress, including trauma-based conditioning, which I know it's a little bit of it's something that you don't really talk about up front, but that's part of it when you're ready for that, okay? But all these elements I am bringing in this art, and I am intending to give people a way to approach it and see how far they want to go with it. And I just want you to know where we're coming from this way. This is a comprehensive system, okay? It is not a piece of this, a piece of that, okay? Everything that I evaluate and I present to you, I have looked at historically. I've looked at through different arts that I've practiced for many, many years. And I've looked at my own experience with it and many other things that are too much to necessarily enumerate. So keep that in mind and understand that when you're looking at something that is particular, understand it that way. Teaching you a technique is teaching you a technique, okay? Wanting to fight in a ring is wanting to fight, okay? These are all particulars, okay? Most times, if you're in a bar and you're in a situation, it's not a life and death situation. If you're a bouncer, and I was a bouncer many, many years in some bad places, that's different. You have to know training how to deal with that because you don't have the option of necessarily walking away. Although a bouncer shouldn't be fighting, and you should know how to handle that so that you're not in a fight unless you absolutely have to be. But most of those situations you'll encounter are not life and death that you can walk away from. Life and death is distinct. And learning how to fight in a ring helps to some degree with that. And that's a good thing. But there are other aspects to it as well. And there are other things, ethically and otherwise, that are important, which we'll get into on a later day.